Good evening, everyone. Welcome to all those here in the room and those of you on York TV. My name is Harvey Woolwind from the Life Enrichment Committee. A double welcome. Yeah, I'm also welcome. Okay, good. For those of you here in the CAC, I'd remind you about your cell phones. Make sure those are turned off. And I would remind you also that when we exit, there's 3 doors, so we don't get bogged down anywhere. And also, for those that would like some help with hearing, there's a headset back here that is helpful, or move up in the front. I've got a seat open here right by me. Our speaker is a graduate of Gustavus Adolphus. I'll bet there's some golden Gusties in the room here. Yeah, right there's one, yeah. His career was mostly in the financial services industry, but he has been making historical presentations to all kinds of groups since 1996, including been in this building, I know at least. This will be at least the 3rd time that I know about, right? And has spoken over 2,500 times. And that's 2,500 to over 70,000 people. And as we approach our country's 250th birthday, what a good time for a historical presentation on Mount Rushmore. Please welcome his return to David Jones.
Okay. Thank you, Harvey. Good evening, folks. Happy to be back here. I've been here, I don't know, I think it was about 7 or 8 times, actually. And I was telling Harvey a little story that back in March of 2020, remember that month? At that moment, middle of March 2020, I had about 100 programs on my schedule for that year, all canceled. Then they slowly started to come back, and I started doing programs on Zoom where I would sit at my dining room table and do a program. But I think it might have been the very first time I was actually on my feet doing a program was in this very room. It was empty. People were watching on the TV upstairs, and so that was kind of a new experience to do one of these programs to an empty room. But nobody fell asleep, so I guess that was good. Well, anyway, so I'm happy to be back here, and I've got an interesting story today about Mount Rushmore, and the tagline there says, "Carving of an Icon." Now, I know there's a religious definition of the word icon, but the word gets used a lot. We talk about something's an icon, or sometimes we refer to a person as an icon. And so in my mind, I think to myself, well, we use that word a lot. It kind of gets thrown around. How do you figure out if something's an icon? In my mind, it first of all has to be very recognizable. And even if you have never seen Mount Rushmore in person, if you see a picture of it, you know what you're looking at. So it's definitely recognizable, but also to be an icon, it should stand for something or represent something. Okay? Mount Rushmore, you could say, represents the first 150 years of our country's history. Now, I'm going to talk about that about halfway through. So I think it qualifies to be called an icon. So we're going to start with a map of South Dakota. And down there in the extreme southwest corner is an area called the Black Hills. In the Black Hills is a mountain named Mount Rushmore. So usually when we say Mount Rushmore, we're only talking about those 4 heads, but there is an entire mountain named Mount Rushmore. So I have a couple of things that I want to talk about before I get into the story of the carving. And the first is my use of the word icon. Now, kind of made the case that it qualifies to be called an icon, but not everybody looks at this thing quite the same way. There are a couple of other opinions of Mount Rushmore. There's one opinion of Mount Rushmore that it's a mutilation. We had this beautiful mountain, and then what did we do? But we went and hacked it all up. Okay, all right. But there's another opinion of Mount Rushmore I'd like to just talk a little bit more in depth, and that is the opinion or the viewpoint that Mount Rushmore is a desecration. Well, this comes from a land dispute with a Native American tribe in the area. And I'm going to tell you the story of the land dispute. It's an important part of the story. So we go back to the mid-1800s. There's a tribe in this area called the Lakota Sioux. And in this time frame, the white man is moving westward. They're moving into this area. For lack of a better word, it was a turbulent time. Lots of bloody battles and so on. Really just to try to gain the peace, the federal government sends negotiators out here, and we sign a treaty with this tribe in 1868 called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. That treaty granted a huge, huge chunk of land to this tribe for eternity. How long do you suppose eternity lasted? 6 years. 1874, they discovered gold in the Black Hills. So this is the 1800s. You can picture what starts to happen. People are flooding into the area, seeking their fortunes. So in 76, a couple years later, the government sends negotiators back out here, approach the tribe. Any chance he'd be willing to renegotiate the treaty? The tribe's response to that was, no, we don't want to renegotiate. We like it just the way it is. So the next year, now it's 1877, Congress got involved, and in 77, Congress passed a bill that essentially just voided the treaty, and we just took the land back. That is what started the land dispute. Now, more than a century goes by. Now it's 1980, and a case about the land dispute makes it up to the Supreme Court. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that act of 1877 was illegal and unconstitutional. Okay, not a lot of debate, all right? But what do we do about it? Now it's 1980. So that ruling had, I like to call it a Part B. Now the Part B was not that the land should be given back, but that the tribe was entitled to compensation for the land that had been taken from them. And we could have a discussion and a debate and an argument about whether that was the right decision or not, but that was the decision in 1980. Well, how much should they receive? So some calculations are done. They add in a century's worth of interest, and they came up with a figure of $105 million. The tribe looked at that and said, we don't want money, we want our land back. And that is exactly where this still sits today. The tribe has continued to refuse to accept the money, thus the land dispute continues. So before I started telling you the story of the land dispute, I said the opinion of Mount Rushmore is it's a desecration. That is because this tribe looks at the Black Hills as sacred land. So when they see those 4 heads cut up there and all these people coming in to see it, it is a desecration of their sacred lands. So it's an important part of the story. So that's the story of the land dispute. Okay, how do we end up with 4 heads up there then? Go to the 1920s. There's a man in South Dakota, his name was Doane Robinson. He is the state historian. In the early 20s, the leaders in South Dakota, they're trying to think creatively. Is there something that we could do here in our state to generate some revenue? Well, he's doing his best. He's trying to think of creative ideas. Then in 1923, he reads a newspaper article about a project happening down in Georgia at a place called Stone Mountain. They are carving a monument to the Confederacy on the side of Stone Mountain. This is 60 years or so after the Civil War. Well, he reads the article and he says, hey, we've got some pretty nice mountains here in South Dakota. What if we were to do something similar here, and then people would plan their vacations, come here and spend money? So he spends some time thinking, what kind of carving would make sense in South Dakota? Well, he came up with an idea of doing a carving that represents the westward expansion of the country, so carving some Western figures. Then, about a year after that, he initially read the article. He sat down and wrote a letter to a man named Gutzon Borglum. And Borglum is the guy who was in charge of the carving at Stone Mountain. And he says in this letter, we have this idea. Would you be willing to come here and talk to us about our idea? And I guess you could say that's how the ball started to roll. So today we have something called the Mount Rushmore National Memorial. They didn't actually start carving until 27, and they worked until 41. So it's a 14-year period. Now the cost ended up being just under $1 million. And by the way, more than 80% of that money came straight from the federal government. To get down to what we see today, they removed 450,000 tons of rock. The heads are 60 feet tall. That would be approximately the scale of a man 460 feet tall. And today, more than 2 million people a year visit Mount Rushmore. So, now I have one more thing that I like to talk about because I get asked about it a lot. So I like to talk about it up front. There's a similar project happening nearby called the Crazy Horse Memorial. I'm seeing a lot of nods in the room right now. Okay, if I speak very technically, this project has nothing to do with Mount Rushmore. They're completely separate. Now, they're close together. I don't know, I think it's like 15 or 20 miles apart, and they're both mountain carvings. And so people visit both of them on the same vacation, but technically these are very different, very separate projects. So here's what's happening. The picture on the left is the model. The picture on the right, it's probably time for me to change my picture. That's, I believe, about a 6-month-old picture of Crazy Horse. So if I had a picture today, you would see some slight differences. So you can say, well, they've made some progress, but they have a long ways to go. Now, the guy who started this project made the first cut in the mountain in 1948. He died in the 1980s. Today, they are still working on this project, but at a very slow rate. So if you start in 1948 and it's 2026, that means we are 78 years into this project. And at the rate they are going, they have decades to go before this would be finished. Now, it is a fascinating project in its own right, and like I said, people visit both on the same vacation, but, if they ever finish it, it's going to be far, far larger than Mount Rushmore, but it is an interesting project in its own right, and so I get asked about it a lot, so I like to talk about it. So now I'm going to jump back to the Mount Rushmore. We've got the 4 presidents from left to right: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln. The way I tell this story now, I'm breaking it into 4 sections. The first one is I talk about this man Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor. Then I'll talk about that 14-year period when they are actually removing rock. Section 3 is called the finishing. Well, technically, Mount Rushmore was never finished, so in this section I will talk about when they stopped working and why they stopped working. And then section 4 is just a little bit about what's going on there today. Okay. Section 1, Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor. Before he is hired to carve Mount Rushmore, this man is already quite well known as a sculptor and an artist around the United States and actually in Europe too. This man, his whole life, was an admirer of Abraham Lincoln. There are a few famous Lincolns that he did. He was not the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial. I would say the most famous Lincoln that he did is on Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, Illinois. There's a bust of Abraham Lincoln. His head is, it's huge. He sculpted that bust. That's probably his most famous one. But to show you how much he admired Abraham Lincoln, he named his son Lincoln Borglum. Now, the boy's name was actually James Lincoln Borglum, but his whole life went by Lincoln Borglum. Now, Gutzon Borglum is a little bit of a complicated guy. He has kind of a Jekyll and Hyde personality, but I really think you have to admit this guy had to have been a genius to take this sculpture down on the ground, and then you're going to translate it many, many times larger up on the side of a mountain and have it turn out the way it did. So, all right, so his personality, he would meet with people. He would get up in front of audiences. People would be inspired by what he was saying. I love your ideas. I want to help. I want to roll up my sleeves. But if you worked closely with him, he's controlling, he's a bully, very difficult to work closely with. There was a group of people in South Dakota who, they worked on the project, although they're not the ones up there removing rock. They're down on the ground. They're managing the money and the paperwork, I always like to say. I call them the committee. The people on the committee approached it like, how about if we take care of this stuff? That'll free you up to just focus on the mountain. Oh no, he wants to control everything. He tries to control what they do. They butt heads. There are a couple of points in this story where they almost had to, pull the plug on the project. He's impossible to deal with. Seems like he was never happy unless everybody around him was mad about something. There were times where they would have enough money, they'd be making good progress, everyone's happy, and then he would do something or say something and get everybody all up in arms. Now, during his lifetime, he was able to develop relationships with United States presidents to the point where he could write a letter to the White House and he could say, I'm coming to Washington. Could I meet with the president? And get this, he would be granted an appointment in the Oval Office. But then, time and time again, he would end up irritating the president, so the president would cut him off. Don't set up any more meetings with this guy, he's too irritating. All right. If you say just the engineering aspect of translating the sculpture up on the side of a mountain, if you say that's kind of like a given, then I would say the next thing, the most difficult part of this whole project turned out to be the money. And I actually think you could say, now here are the difficulties with money on the Mount Rushmore project, and from that I can draw a straight line right over to Gutzon Borglum and his relationship with money. He's an artist. And as an artist, he has a very irregular income stream. His attitude about money was, don't worry about it. Just live your life. The money will come. But in the process, he's living beyond his means in his personal life. Then he would have those people who would say things like, I love your ideas. I want to help. And they might say, how about if we get started on fundraising? Fundraising can be some hard work. And he would say, don't bother. The money will come. So you don't need us to do it? No, don't bother. We'll have plenty of money. All right, so then some time goes by. Nobody is doing anything to raise money, and the money is not just miraculously showing up like he seemed to think it would be, and now he's mad. What's going on? How come nobody's working on this? Am I the only one who believes in it? You told people not to do anything. It doesn't matter. I guess I'm the only one who believes in this. All right, Stone Mountain. So this is the project he's working on when he's hired to carve Mount Rushmore. We are in the 1920s, which is about 60 years after the Civil War. There's a group of women in Georgia called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, it's a group of women whose fathers and grandfathers had fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy. The women in this group are proud of their heritage, and they want to see this commemorated up on the side of Stone Mountain. He's hired to do this carving, and it was not going well at all. He was fighting with everybody. They had money problems, and then periodically he would just disappear. Well, where is he? Turns out he sculpted a statue on the side to make a little extra money, and he finished it. So he just took off and went to Europe to go sell it. So now the people in Georgia, they're getting very frustrated with him. Why is this not getting done? And by the way, where is he? So they're frustrated with him. Well, then he gets the letter from the guy up in South Dakota, Doane Robinson, the guy with the idea. As soon as he got that letter, he says, yes, absolutely, I want to do that project. He jumps on a train, heads up to South Dakota to talk to those folks about the project that will eventually become Mount Rushmore. Now the people in Georgia find out that he makes this trip. And they said, can you believe this guy? He can't even finish our project in a timely manner. Now he's talking to people in South Dakota about doing a similar project at the same time. That is not going to work. So in the very beginning of 1925, the people in Georgia fired him from the Stone Mountain project. Well, he is so angry about being fired that as he's Going out the door, he took a hammer and he breaks the models that he's been working from. He ends up being charged with a crime and had to flee the state of Georgia, or else he would have been arrested. To my knowledge, never set foot in Georgia the rest of his life. So the people in Georgia think if we can just get rid of him, we'll hire a new sculptor who'll come in and just finish the project. So they hire a new sculptor. That sculptor doesn't have models to work from, so they kind of muddled along for a while, and then the project kind of just fizzled out and died. It came back a couple decades later. Today, there is a monument to the Confederacy on the side of Stone Mountain. It was finished in the 1970s. If you've ever seen it or seen a picture of it, it has nothing to do with Borglum, because when they started over, first thing they did, dynamited off what he had started. And they started from scratch. So that's the story of Stone Mountain. All right. Now, Borglum gets that letter from the guy up in South Dakota, Doane Robinson. He heads up there. He goes to Rapid City, the nearest big city, and he speaks to a meeting of a bunch of civic leaders and business people. And he said, I'm in. I want to do your project. However, the letter that you sent to me talked about this idea of representing the westward expansion of the country. He said, that's small potatoes. Let's think big here. He talked about his idea of carving presidents, for example. He said, we could create a shrine of democracy. Now, on this first trip, he does not know that he's about to get fired from Stone Mountain. So he talks about it. He said, well, by the way, I'm working on this project down in Georgia. How about if we referred to that one as the Southern Memorial, and then this one can be called the Northern Memorial? Now, this never happens, but you have to pause and think about this for a second. Think about Mount Rushmore, the way it exists today, and then try to conjure up a scenario where it would make sense to match Mount Rushmore, the way it exists today, match that up with a monument to the Confederacy. It doesn't make any sort of sense. Of course, this never happened, but in his mind made perfect sense. Well, on the first trip, he said, I think this project is going to take 6 years and $500,000. Except I showed you that it took 14 years and $1 million, but the problem was in 1924, when people in South Dakota heard $500,000, they panicked. How are we ever going to raise $500,000? But you know what Borglum said? Don't worry about it. The money will come. Okay. So now he's on board. The next step is to find a location, and Mount Rushmore was not the first choice. The guy with the idea, Doane Robinson, he wants to do it at a place in the Black Hills called the Needles. Got these things sticking up, and Robinson thought, would it work to carve 360 degrees? Well, that would have been pretty interesting if they could have pulled it off. So Borglum and his party, they go up, they hike around, and they came down and said, it won't work. The stone in the Needles is too soft. There are too many cracks. It just wouldn't hold. So you need to find another mountain. So they hike around, look at a couple other mountains, and they came across Mount Rushmore. And this is a before picture of Mount Rushmore. Now, he liked this one because that face is angled southeast, so the sun rises in the east and goes across the southern sky. What you carve here is going to be in the sun most of the day. That was very appealing to him. So this is a before picture. I'm going to change it to an after picture. Okay? This is before, and that's after. I'm going to do that again. Before, and then they removed 450,000 tons of rock after. It's pretty dramatic when you look at it that way. Well, I have a quote from Borglum, and I love this quote because I feel like it just kind of demonstrates his mindset or his mentality about what he felt he was working on. American art ought to be monumental, in keeping with American life. Mount Rushmore should be colossal, in keeping with American achievement. Okay, in keeping with American achievement, the decision has been made, we're carving presidents. So which ones? Well, I said there's this committee, and Borglum, they're having conversations, and finally, the first one everybody agrees on is George Washington. He represents the birth of the nation. Oh, that's a pretty easy one to agree on. The second one everybody agrees on is Abraham Lincoln. He represents the preservation of the nation, kept us together during the Civil War. That was also kind of an easy one. The third one they agreed on was Thomas Jefferson. Well, okay, now, we think he was a good president. Why would we include him in something like this? Officially, the reason Jefferson is up there is he represents the expansion of the nation, and that refers to the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the land area of the United States. Now, number 4, some controversy creeps in. Teddy Roosevelt. Ooh, well, okay, we think he was a good president, but why would we include him in something like this? Officially, the reason Roosevelt is up there is he represents the development of the nation, which refers to the Panama Canal. During his presidency, we make substantial progress on the canal, and it opened very soon after he left office. When that canal opened, the economic benefit to the United States, excuse me, the economic benefit to the United States of that canal was that it turned us from a regional power into a world power in some respects. But the reason Roosevelt was controversial, so they're having these conversations, 1924, 25. Teddy Roosevelt died in 1919. And people were saying, well, we think he was a good president, but, you know how it is. Sometimes you get a couple decades down the line and you look back at a president and you say, I don't think he was really as good as we thought at the time, or maybe he was better than we thought at the time. Those things can happen. Maybe it's a little soon to put him up there. But actually, Borglum considered him to have been a personal friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and essentially he wanted Roosevelt up there. The rest of the people on the committee kind of just backed down and let him have his way. So what does Mount Rushmore represent? Birth, preservation, expansion, development of the nation, first 150 years of our history. Okay, so now we're going to start to remove some rock, and you're going to see some pretty interesting pictures as I go along here. Okay, for starters, Borglum creates a scale model. This is his scale model. It's actually on display at Mount Rushmore. 1 inch on the model is the equivalent of 1 foot up on the mountain. As they are going through this project, Borglum was constantly working with tweaking and adjusting the model. He's got crews up there removing rock, and sometimes the crew might come across a crack, for example. So he would want to adjust the model to work around the crack. He wants to make sure that the model and the mountain stay perfectly in sync throughout this whole project. So he was constantly working with it. Well, there were 3 major steps in removing rock. When they started this project, the rock on the outside was gray and weathered and dirty. So the first step, we're going to remove an outer layer, and they did this with dynamite. Now, when I use the figure of 450,000 tons, most of that was removed with dynamite. Now you're down to the white granite. Now you're going to start to shape the heads. So they're using jackhammers where they're drilling down till you get the basic outline of a head. The third step, I like to call it the fine finishing, where you're making eyebrows, noses, and lips using pneumatic drills like this man is using, where you're just kind of shaving little bits of rock off. Some of the working conditions. You had to start your day, go to the top of the mountain, and then be lowered down. And you can see they're in almost, looks like some kind of a sling or something to be lowered down over the side. The pay range. You would start out at 50 cents an hour, and the real proven professionals will be making $1.50 an hour. But, of course, we have to keep in mind most of this work happens in the 1930s. I bet that was a pretty darn good wage for the day. Now, whenever I look at those pictures, though, I think, what a different time we're in. Look at that. You don't see people wearing hard hats or steel-toed boots. Nobody's wearing masks. Just a different time. Well, later in life, a number of the men who worked up there recorded oral histories to preserve their memories of doing this work, and they're fascinating. In those oral histories, some of those guys would talk about, so here I am, I'm hanging over the side, and then I get this jackhammer, which might weigh as much as 60 pounds. I have to lift this thing up, get it perpendicular to the rock, which means parallel to the ground, and get some leverage and drill down in. Now, we have all seen people using jackhammers, but what are they doing? Curbs and sidewalks. Now I'm going to lift this thing up. Now it's parallel to the ground. Brace myself, get some leverage, and drill down in. Just seems kind of amazing. Well, I said you have to start your day, go to the top of the mountain, and be lower down. When they start this project, there's no elevator or passenger lift to get to the top. So they started by building this elaborate set of ladders and staircases. Well, here's how your workday starts. In the morning, you arrive at the base of the mountain. First thing you have to do, walk up the equivalent of a 40-story building. Now you're ready to start your workday. In the oral histories, some of those guys would talk about how in the hottest part of the summer, the white granite would absorb the sun's heat to the point where it was too hot to touch with your bare hand. And I'm inches away from it drilling on it. The workers had to endure numerous work stoppages. So they would usually shut down for the hardest part of the winter, but usually the reason they shut down was they ran out of money. So they run out of money, everyone gets laid off, some time goes by, they get some money, the call goes out, and they show up again to work. But also, they're working for this guy, Borglum. He's got that Jekyll and Hyde personality, got one of those trigger tempers, some little thing will just set him off, and he fires you, and the next day he hires you back. Now, there was a woman who worked on this project as Borglum's personal secretary, and she recorded one of those oral histories too. And you know what she said? I stopped counting at 17 the number of times he fired me and rehired me the next day. That is a tough guy to work for. So during the whole story of the carving, there were only 2 accidents of any note, and no one died carving Mount Rushmore, which I think is remarkable. However, a number of the men who worked up there developed a condition called silicosis, and this is a lung condition, and it came from inhaling all this granite dust. They're blasting, they're drilling, the dust is just floating through the air, they're not wearing masks, they breathe it in, and later in life, they can't breathe. So, now I said money might have been the hardest part. The funding was always erratic. They could never figure out where is the next funding coming from, how much will it be, and when are we going to receive it. So they're trying to piece this thing together. Even though I said they worked for 14 years, they were shut down for over half of that time. Now, it's now 1925. Borglum has been fired from Stone Mountain. So now he's focusing on Mount Rushmore, and he's giving speeches and talking to folks, and he's saying, this project will be privately funded. I showed you at the beginning, more than 80% of the money came straight from the federal government. So this doesn't turn out to be true, but because he is saying things like this, nobody is doing anything to raise money. So a couple years go by, and they have raised less than $10,000. At this point, though, there was a thought that, why don't we just start? Maybe if we just start, people will hear about it, they'll get excited, they'll start to come to understand the project, and they'll start to donate. So they decided to start the project. The first cut was made in the mountain in October of 27, and by December they were already out of money. 1928 rolls around. There's no money. There was no work done on Mount Rushmore in 1928. 1929 rolls around. There's still no money. So during the early part of 29, the people on this committee put their heads together and they said, what we're doing is not working. We need a different strategy. So it was during the early part of 29, the folks on the project came up with the idea of going to United States Congress to ask for funding. And it worked. In early 29, Congress approved funds for the project, so now they could get started again. Well, so that means, you think about it, they started October 27, they worked for 2 months, and then they were shut down for more than a year and a half. But the 1929 bill is actually a very, very important part of this whole story. That's where we got the name, Mount Rushmore National Memorial. It actually came from that bill. Also in that bill, it specifies admission to view Mount Rushmore shall be free forever. Okay, now if you like a good silver lining in a story, here comes the silver lining in this story. So this is happening in early 29. Let's see. Can we think of anything important that happened in the fall of 1929? The stock market crashes, sends us into the Depression. Okay, the funds have already been earmarked. They've already been allocated. Go ahead, work on your project. But imagine if those two things had happened in reverse order. The funds have not yet been allocated, the market has crashed, and then the folks on the project say, let's go to Congress to ask for funding. I'm pretty sure Congress would have said, I think we have some bigger fish to fry. We don't have money to carve a mountain in rural South Dakota. Why would we do that? And maybe they never would have gotten started again. So the silver lining was they got that first funding through Congress shortly before the market crashes. Now we're into the 30s, which ends up being the heart of the carving. The funding is still erratic, but there were a couple years where they did have really good funding and made some really good progress. But all in all, it's never fully funded. Now, during the 30s, the folks on this project essentially gave up trying to find any other sources of funding. They just decided Congress is our only source. So they're going back to Congress, they're going back, and they're going back, and frankly, the people in Congress are getting a little tired of it. You know, we give them money, 6 months or a year later, they're back for more. When is this going to be done? But the people who were making the requests actually have something going for them. We started this to create a tourist attraction, and it's working. People are showing up. Some of the reasons people were showing up were that the roads had been improved to Mount Rushmore. In 1930, there was a dedication of George Washington's head that ended up being the first time you could actually drive a car all the way to Mount Rushmore. Before that, you had to take a trail through the woods. Now, during the 30s, there was this project called the Iron Mountain Road, and it's this curvy road through the Black Hills, and in a couple places they did, just like in this picture. You come around a bend, and it's almost like it's in a picture frame as Mount Rushmore. It's very dramatic. Now, I mentioned Borglum's son, Lincoln Borglum. Well, he actually worked on this project the whole time alongside of his father, and he was a bit of a photographer, and he took photographs, and those photographs ended up being distributed all over the place to newspapers and magazines. So what you have is people all over looking at the pictures, reading the stories, and saying, I think I'd like to go see this for myself. So people are starting to show up. Okay, section 3, the finishing. As I said, it was technically never finished. But as they went along, there was a dedication ceremony of each one of the 4 heads. Now, the first one dedicated was George Washington on the 4th of July, 1930. 4th of July is a perfect date to do something like that. The second one they dedicated was Thomas Jefferson, and they chose this date because President Franklin Delano Roosevelt agreed to come and participate in the ceremony. Then Lincoln is dedicated on the 150th anniversary of the Constitution, and Roosevelt on the 50th anniversary of South Dakota statehood. So for each of these dates, they created an event, and then thousands and thousands and thousands of people showed up for the chance to participate in the ceremony, which in itself generates interest and publicity. Well, now we're into this period of 40-41. It's almost over, but we don't know that yet. Now, during 1940, people in this country could see the distinct possibility there's another big war looming. Country's pretty divided yet because the memories of World War I are still pretty fresh, but the people on the Mount Rushmore project started to worry. If we go back to war, the money's probably going to get cut off. And then, well, probably better be honest with ourselves. Borglum's getting up there in years. What if something happens to him? If either one of those two things happens, we're probably done. So during 1940, the folks on the project pressured Borglum to finish the faces. Even though they'd already dedicated all 4 of them, there was a little bit of fine finishing work yet to be done. And they said, you might not get everything you want, but if we have to end this project prematurely, we would be stuck with these unfinished faces forever. So much of the work in 1940 was just focused on finishing the faces. Now, it's early 1941. The folks on the project go to Congress, and they ask for over $300,000 Congress responds with, we'll give you $86,000 and we're done. Don't ask us for any more money. We're not even going to entertain a request. Okay? So the money's been cut off. Not even 10 days after that decision, Borglum died suddenly. He had had fairly routine surgery. He was recovering, and he had a heart attack and died. Both things they were worried about happened in a 10-day period. It's over. During 41, his son, Lincoln Borglum, takes over. He supervises the crew, and they essentially just worked until the money was gone. The last day of work on Mount Rushmore, October 31st, 1941. So, sometimes you might hear someone say, when was Mount Rushmore finished? That's the date that people use. But the only thing that happened on that date was they finally ran out of money and stopped working. Now, to say it was never finished, of course, you go back to the scale model. See, the idea was to carve them all the way down to their waists. Didn't even get close to that. Another thing that was never finished was something called the Hall of Records. Now, so I'm just going to step in front here. Here's Lincoln. And behind Lincoln, there is what looks like an entryway or a doorway. And from the right angle, you can see this. Now, this is what the unfinished Hall of Records is about. Borglum was thinking of a couple of places in the world. Specifically, he thought about Stonehenge and Easter Island, where you have rock formations and statues. And let's face it, nobody really, really knows for sure who did it and why and what does it represent. We got all kinds of theories, but in the end, no one knows for sure. He was worried the same thing might happen to his project. He said, we owe it to the people of the future to tell them, who are these four men, or who were these four men? Who worked on this and what does it represent? So he wants to create this thing called the Hall of Records. They start carving behind Lincoln's head, and you could think of it as we're going to hollow out the next peak over. Then they would build a grand staircase in front of the faces, and then as a visitor, you would go up the staircase, you'd go around Lincoln, you would go into the Hall of Records, and that is where you would find the history of these four men, the history of this project. There would be carved copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, busts and statues of other presidents. Well, it was never finished. From the right angle, you can see that entryway, but the general public is not allowed up there. I've read descriptions, I've seen pictures of it. If you could stand right there, think of a hallway that goes away from you into the mountain. It goes in, I don't know, about 30 or 40 feet and just kind of dead ends. So that's all it is. So from the right angle, you can see this, but that is the unfinished Hall of Records. When Borglum died, the family was given the option of having him buried at Mount Rushmore. But the family said no. They said he will never rest in peace lying next to his unfinished work. So instead, he's buried in Forest Lawn. That's out in California. That's Celebrity Cemetery. All the movie stars are buried at Forest Lawn. So, okay, section 4, a little bit about what's going on there today. So as I said, this has started to create a tourist attraction, and they said more than 2 million visitors a year. It's now managed by the National Park Service. In 1998, the Park Service opens a brand new visitor center. It's beautiful. Top picture on the top, they have this nice viewing area. And then in the picture on the bottom, they created this walkway. You have all the state flags, and they angled this thing perfectly so that as you're walking along, you got all these state flags right straight ahead of you are those four heads. And then the project includes restaurants and gift shops, and there's a museum that tells the story I'm telling. But the project also included a parking ramp. That was a big deal, because before this, all the parking was in a bunch of surface lots. In the summer, on the weekends, it could get really hard to find a parking place. When the ramp opened up, it took some of the pressure off the parking. However, the ramp generated a little bit of controversy. Okay, we got that bill from 1929, the one where we got the name Mount Rushmore National Memorial. In that bill, it specified admission to view Mount Rushmore shall be free forever. But when they opened the ramp, they said, we're going to charge you to park your car. And people rose up in protest and said, "What do you mean charge me to park my car? It's not like I can park at the strip mall on the other side of the road and walk over. There's nowhere else to park up there. I follow this curvy road up the mountain. My only choice is the ramp. Isn't that a backdoor way of charging admission?" Well, it was upheld, still exists today. It's been a few years since I was there, but at last fall, 25, I talked to a woman who had been there in the summer of 25, and I said, "How much are they charging for parking now?" And she said, $20. Makes no difference how many people are in the car, but so still exists today. Well, today the Park Service does maintenance on Mount Rushmore, and they did this for the first time in 1991. They did this really elaborate, extensive survey. You're kind of looking for movement in the rocks. Well, during that survey, they were able to identify a number of cracks in Mount Rushmore. Well, with a crack, here's what you're worried about. Water gets in there, and then you have freeze, thaw, expand, contract. A small crack turns into a big crack, or a big crack turns into a real problem. So every fall, you've got Park Service personnel, like in this picture, they go up and they rappel around, and they're looking for cracks. Now, there are plenty they know about, but they're looking for new ones. And they take measurements on them, and then they use silicone sealant on the cracks. You're just trying to keep the water out, just trying to preserve this for future generations. Well, getting close to the end, but some of the things about Mount Rushmore that you may or may not know, or you may or may not notice when you look at it. First one is how lifelike the eyes are. I hear a lot of comments about that, and a lot of busts and statues are sculpted with smooth eyeballs. People think they look a little bit lifeless. Well, they did something interesting. In each one of the eyeballs, they left a column of granite that sticks out from the center of the eyeball. The end of the column of granite becomes the pupil. That column of granite is about 10 feet long, by the way. The end of the column is the pupil. And now because you have these things sticking out of the eyes and the sun is going across the sky, the shadows make the eyes seem more lifelike. Now, you can be there and you'll stand there and you look up and say, "I can't believe how lifelike those eyes are." You can't really tell what they did. You either have to see a close-up photograph or get a really, really strong set of binoculars. When they started this project, Thomas Jefferson was supposed to be on the other side of George Washington. They got started on Jefferson. They did his nose, eyebrows, forehead, hairline, and what happened was they ran into a bunch of soft rock and cracks. So finally, Borglum went back to the scale model. He took Jefferson's head from one side of Washington, moved it to the other, sent the crews back up there. They dynamited off what they had started, and they started over on the other side of Washington with Thomas Jefferson. Well, speaking of Jefferson, one question a lot of folks wonder about is, why is Jefferson looking up? Because it seems like the other three are just looking straight ahead, but Jefferson's looking up. And it's interesting because once in a while, I will read an article or something where the writer is claiming that Borglum did that on purpose. He said, Jefferson, he's a visionary, a philosopher. He is looking to the heavens. Well, there's actually a more practical story. So Borglum has a crew up there taking measurements and so on. They came down at some point and said, "We have a problem. There's a crack up there. And if we keep going the way you have us going, that crack is going to run right across Thomas Jefferson's right nostril." And Borglum was worried that in 50 years or 500 years, Thomas Jefferson's nose might fall off. So to prevent that, Borglum goes back to the scale model. He takes Jefferson's head. First he turned it a little bit, and then he tilted it backward about 5 degrees, which moved the crack from his nostril to his cheek. But when you tilt the head back 5 degrees, now some people think you are looking to the heavens, but in fact, you're just trying to avoid a crack. So anytime you look at Mount Rushmore, you notice Jefferson's looking up. That was done to avoid a crack. Now this next one, this is really easy to miss. But I like it partly because of that reason. It's like most people do not see this when they look at it. The beginnings of Abraham Lincoln's left hand. You see, he was supposed to be grasping the lapel of his coat like this, and they kind of just got started on his knuckles. Really easy to miss, and most people don't even notice that when they look at it. Or how about Roosevelt's glasses? How do you do something like that? Well, you carve a nose piece, then you put a line under each eye, so when you and I look at it, we see glasses. But they're not there. There are no glasses there. There's just a line over his nose and a line under each eye. But the way they did it looks exactly like he's wearing glasses, doesn't it? Okay. See that picture? See all that rock lying there? That's the rock that used to be up here. They blasted, they drilled, the rock fell, that's where it sits. If the Borglum had lived, if the project had continued, he was planning that would all be cleared away, hauled away, but they had to end it prematurely, and so the rock sits there today. Got trees growing through it now. I'm sure it will forever. That's the rock that used to be up here. All right, I'm going to finish with one more quote from Borglum, and I think what happened was about halfway through the project, someone goes to him and says, what are you trying to show or represent or symbolize with this project? And I love this quote from him. It's a little bit thought-provoking. Here's what he said. I want somewhere in America a few feet of stone that bears witness to things we accomplished as a nation, carved high as close to heaven as we can. Then breathe a prayer that the wind and rain alone shall wear them away. The wind and rain alone shall wear them away. That's erosion. A geologist would tell us that the stone on Mount Rushmore will erode at the rate of about 1 inch every 10,000 years. So, if you take good care of it, this is going to be here for a long, long, long time to come. And there it says I've reached the end. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you.
Have any questions? How many have been to Mount Rushmore?
Many, yep.
Most, of course.
I'm just fascinated wondering how they got the scale, the model, so perfectly on that rock. Did they do an outline, or how did they do that?
Okay, you just touched on the part that is mind-boggling to me. Okay, the best I can explain it, if you have ever hung wallpaper, you know the concept of a plumb bob, where you hang this thing down there? So they would put a board over the edge of the mountain and hang a plumb bob down. That becomes the center of the nose. And then he would send his crews up there and say, all right, from that point, you're going to measure over 12 inches, and you're going to drill down 12 inches. Then you're going to measure over another 18 inches, and you're going to drill down 6 inches. And then they're hanging from this sling. They're just following his directions. Keep in mind, they can't stop and go, am I doing this right? He can't do that when you're hanging in a sling over the side. So they just followed his instructions. So he had this in his mind, how to do this, and he was able to put it in instructions that other people could follow and carry out. That's why I say I think he might be a difficult person to deal with, but you got to admit there's a lot of genius lurking there. So, yeah.
David, I don't remember you saying anything about the number of people that were working at any one time. What's a maximum or average or something?
Yeah, I think if you took the total number of people who worked on the project over the length of it was about 400, but I think it was around 200 were pretty much there from the beginning to the end, and the rest were kind of coming and going. So a lot of the workers learned how to do these, operating these big tools and all that kind of stuff as miners. That's how they learned those skills. But think about it. They're used to working underground. Now we're going to have you do the same thing, but you're hanging off the side of a mountain. That's a little different skill set, So, yeah. So, please.
There's an Alfred Hitchcock movie,
Yep.
North by Northwest, and some of that, it looks like the people are on the top of the statues. You know anything about
Yep.
the filming of that, the set?
Yep. So the Alfred Hitchcock movie North by Northwest includes, toward the end, has Mount Rushmore plays a big role, and it's Cary Grant and Ava Marie Saint, and they're running around and they're hanging off the noses and stuff like that. So here's what I've read about it is that Alfred Hitchcock asked the National Park Service for permission to film there, and they turned him down. So most of what you see in that movie was recreated on a sound stage in Hollywood. There's only one scene that is the actual Mount Rushmore, and that's when they're in a car driving to Mount Rushmore, and there in the distance is Mount Rushmore. That is the real one. But otherwise, when they're running around, so a lot of the stuff they were doing, you couldn't really do, or in the real life. But yeah, I get asked about that one a lot. It's a great movie. I like it. So.
You mentioned that the public is not allowed up there. So my question is there some type of security that this wouldn't be damaged by some person or persons?
So when I was specifically talking about that unfinished Hall of Records, you can't go up there and stand there. But I have talked to people all the time who said, well, when I was a kid, we used to camp up on the top of where, and they don't let people, it's all securities and cameras and, fenced off areas and that sort of thing. And it's pretty well monitored, I believe. So, yeah. So, yes, ma'am.
I wonder if any of the workers at that project still alive.
Oh, yeah. There was, some of the workers would sometimes go and just be at Mount Rushmore in the gift shop, signing autographs and telling stories and that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure the last person who actually worked removing rock has passed away now. Been several years, I believe. So, yep.
Was anyone injured?
So there were 2 accidents of any note. One was, I believe, someone fell, but it didn't turn out to be too bad. And the other was, I said they didn't have an elevator to get to the top, but they had created this almost like a little cable car from the ground up to the top, and the cable car was supposed to haul tools and that sort of thing, but the workers would sometimes climb in and ride in it. They weren't supposed to. And I guess what happened was some guys climbed in on the way down, and the extra weight caused it to lose control, and this thing went crashing down in the bottom, and everybody was thrown, but nobody died. So those were really the 2 main accidents, and no one died carving Mount Rushmore, which seems kind of hard to believe. But
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank our speaker again.
thank you very much. Thank you.
And just a couple of announcements. Next Tuesday, Music and Arts is going to be here with a sculptor, ironically. A sculptor that if you walk around Centennial Lakes, you'll see some of his things there, or the 6-foot golden gopher on campus. You'll see that one. And then the following Tuesday, Life in Richmond will be back with a speaker. And he's going to share some magic with us to improve our memory. Okay. So, a couple of good speakers coming up, or good activities coming up. Thank you for coming. Good night.